The autumn of 1887 came early to the town of Harwick,
You
Virginia.
came back.
The leaves turned before September was even finished, and the wind off the Blue Ridge carried a chill that made the older residents shake their heads and mutter about hard winters ahead. For most people in Harwick, it was simply the changing of seasons. For Clara Ashwood, it was the beginning of a wait that would reshape everything she believed about love, loyalty, and the nature of a promise. Clara
Frost
was
is settling.
23 years
We
old
should
that
move
fall,
soon.
the youngest daughter of a modestly successful merchant named Gerald Ashwood, whose dry goods store sat at the center of Harwick's Main Street. She was not the kind of woman who attracted attention by force of beauty alone, though she was certainly handsome. What people noticed about Clara was the steadiness behind her eyes, the way she listened before she spoke, the quiet certainty she carried in every room she entered. Her older sister, Ruth, often said that Clara had been born 40 years old. Clara took it as a compliment. The man she was waiting for was named Thomas Alcott. He had grown up 3 streets over, the son of a tailor, and had spent his childhood trailing behind Clara and Ruth at every church social and river picnic Harwick had to offer. By the time they were both 18, it was understood by everyone in town, and by Thomas and Clara themselves, that they would eventually marry. There was no dramatic declaration, no moonlit proposal. It was simply a fact the way sunrise was a fact. You did not question it. You simply waited for it to arrive. Thomas left for a government surveying position in the Western Territories in the spring of 1886. The separation was supposed to last 18 months. He promised to write every 2 weeks without fail, and for the first 4 months, he kept that promise. Clara kept every letter in a cedar box beneath her bed, each one read so many times the paper had begun to soften at the folds. Then, in October of 1886, the letters stopped. At first Clara told herself it was the mail routes. The Western Territories were not known for reliable postal service, and she had heard stories of letters arriving in batches, 6 at a time, after weeks of delay. She kept writing to Thomas even as she waited for his replies, filling pages with the small details of Harwick life, her father's new shipment of fabric bolts, the way the frost had taken out half the Penner family's apple crop, the way the town square looked on the first real cold morning of the year. She wrote because writing felt like holding on. By January of 1887, she had received nothing for 3 months. Her father, ever practical, suggested gently that perhaps she should consider the possibility that Thomas had found his circumstances changed. Clara did not respond to that suggestion. Her mother, softer in her approach, said only that young men in distant places sometimes lost their footing. Neither of them said the word everyone in Harwick was beginning to think. The word was, gone. It was in this state of suspended waiting, somewhere between hope and grief, that Clara first encountered Edmund Voss. Edmund Voss arrived in Harwick on a Tuesday morning in late February of 1887, riding a horse that had clearly been pushed hard and recently. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been arranged by weather and long stretches of outdoor work into something that was severe without being unkind. He wore the dusty coat of a man who had been traveling for days, and he asked at the inn for directions to the Ashwood residence before he had even taken a room. Clara was alone in the front parlor when he knocked. Her parents had gone to visit a cousin 2 towns over and were not expected back until evening. She answered the door herself, which was not entirely proper but was entirely Clara. She looked at the stranger on her porch, the tired lines around his eyes, the careful set of his jaw, and something in her chest went very still. She did not know Edmund Voss. She had never heard Thomas mention his name. But she knew, before he spoke a single word, that whatever he had come to say was going to change her life. There are moments like that, where the world holds its breath and you hold yours with it, and everything that comes after is measured from that particular second. Edmund removed his hat. He introduced himself as a fellow surveyor who had worked alongside Thomas Alcott in the New Mexico Territory for the better part of a year. He said he had ridden from the nearest telegraph station, 3 days east, specifically to bring her news in person rather than through a wire, because he felt that was the only decent thing to do. He said all of this carefully, measuring each word, watching her face. Then he told her that Thomas Alcott had died in November, in a flash flood along a canyon survey route. The body had been recovered. There had been a burial. Edmund had been present for both. Clara heard the words. She understood them in the part of her mind that processed language and assigned it meaning. But for a long moment, she simply stood in the doorway of her family's house, her hand still on the door frame, and did not move. Edmund stood on the porch, hat in hand, giving her whatever time she needed, not filling the silence with reassurance or apology, simply waiting. Later, she would think that was the first thing she noticed about him, that he knew how to be present in a terrible moment without trying to soften it into something it was not. She invited him inside. She made tea, because she needed something to do with her hands. She asked him questions, about the survey work, about how Thomas had seemed in those final months, about whether he had spoken of home. Edmund answered all of them honestly and fully, and when he did not know the answer, he said so plainly. He did not perform grief he did not feel, and he did not pretend to a closeness with Thomas that had not existed. They had been colleagues, he said. They had respected each other. Thomas had spoken of Clara often, and always in a way that made it clear she was the fixed point he was working his way back toward. That last detail undid her in a way none of the rest had. She set down her teacup very carefully and cried without making much sound, the way people cry when they have been holding something a long time and there is finally nowhere left to hold it. Edmund did not move to comfort her. He sat across the table and let her be exactly where she was. When she was finished, he handed her his handkerchief, clean, pressed, folded into quarters, and waited until she looked at him again. Then he said, there was one more thing. Thomas Alcott, in the weeks before he died, had known that the survey route was dangerous. Flash flooding in the canyon country was not a rumor, it was a documented risk that the survey team had been warned about repeatedly. Thomas had written a letter, unsealed, and given it to Edmund with instructions to deliver it to Clara in the event that something happened to him. Edmund reached into his coat and placed the letter on the table between them. Clara looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. The handwriting on the front, her name, in Thomas's careful hand, was enough to make the room feel unsteady. She opened it slowly, and she read it alone while Edmund stepped outside to see to his horse, giving her the privacy that the moment required. If you want to understand everything that came after, you have to understand what was in that letter. Thomas had written about the survey work, and about the landscape he had spent a year mapping, the way the light fell differently in the Western Territories than it did in Virginia. He had written about missing Harwick, and missing her specifically, with a plainness that was both characteristic of him and almost unbearable to read. He had written about their future, the house he had been saving toward, the life he had mapped out as carefully as any canyon route. And then, near the end, he had written about Edmund Voss. He had written that Edmund was the finest man he had worked alongside, a man of absolute reliability and decency, who had no family waiting for him and no particular roots anywhere. He had written that if anything happened to him on the survey routes, he wanted Clara to know that Edmund had agreed to carry any letters or messages she might need delivered, to assist her family in any way that was required, and, this was the part Clara read 3 times before she believed she was reading it correctly, to consider, if she was willing and if it seemed right after a proper period of time, whether Edmund might make a suitable husband. Thomas had not ordered her. He had not arranged anything behind her back or presumed to determine her future without her consent. He had written simply that Edmund was a good man, that good men were not always easy to find, and that he could not bear the thought of Clara waiting for someone who was not coming back. He had asked Edmund to make the offer. He had left the answer entirely to Clara. He had signed the letter with her name and the words, "You were always the fixed point." Edmund came back inside when she opened the door. He stood in the entrance to the parlor and looked at her, and she could see that he had rehearsed some version of this moment, had probably rehearsed it for the entire 3-day ride from the telegraph station. But whatever he had planned to say, he said something else instead. He said, "I know this is an impossible thing to ask. I know you do not know me. I made Thomas a promise and I am here to keep it, but I want you to understand that I will not press you, I will not return unless you write to me first, and if you decide never to write, I will consider the promise fulfilled and I will trouble you no further." Clara looked at this man, This stranger who had ridden 3 days to stand on her porch and deliver the worst news of her life and then the strangest proposal she had ever heard, and she said, "Tell me something true about yourself. Not something Thomas told you to tell me. Something you would tell me on your own." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am 31 years old and I have never in my life stayed anywhere long enough to know my neighbors' names. I am not sure whether that is a character flaw or simply a fact about me. I thought it was simply a fact until Thomas started talking about Harwick, and then I started to wonder." Clara nodded slowly. She said, "You should take a room at the inn tonight. You look like you have not slept properly in days." He said, "That is true." She said, "I will think about what you have told me." He said, "That is all I am asking." Harwick formed its opinion of Edmund Voss before he had finished his first week in town. The opinion was not entirely favorable, though it was not entirely unfavorable either. People could see that he was capable and serious and not given to idleness, which counted for something. What they could not quite square was the circumstances of his arrival and the nature of his connection to the Ashwood family, specifically to Clara. The story spread, as stories in small towns always spread, in a version that was close enough to the truth to be believable and distorted enough to be interesting. By the end of the first week, most of Harwick understood that Thomas Alcott was dead, that this Edmund Voss had been with him when he died, and that he had arrived on Clara's doorstep with some kind of arrangement in mind. The details of the arrangement, specifically, that it had been Thomas's own idea, got softer and more complicated as the story passed from person to person, until some versions had Edmund as an opportunist who had taken advantage of a grief-stricken woman, and other versions had him as a noble figure honoring a dying man's wish, and a few versions had him as something stranger and less easily categorized. Clara's mother had a great deal to say about the situation, most of it quietly, in the kitchen, where she believed Clara could not hear. Clara could always hear. Her mother's position was that it was deeply irregular and that Clara needed time to grieve Thomas properly before she entertained any thoughts of another man, which was reasonable. Her other position, expressed with somewhat less delicacy, was that Edmund Voss had a look about him that suggested he would not stay long wherever he landed, which was a concern. Clara did not tell her mother that Edmund had said essentially the same thing about himself. Her father was more measured. He met Edmund at the inn one afternoon, under the pretense of welcoming a visitor to town, and came home that evening with a more complicated expression than he had left with. When Clara asked him what he thought, he said, "He is not what I expected." Clara asked what he had expected. Her father said, "I am not entirely sure." Something easier to dismiss. If you are asking whether this community should be invested in Clara Ashwood's decisions, and I think many of you watching this already are, then let me say this: the people who loved her most wanted her to be safe. They wanted her grief to be honored and her future to be protected. Those are good things to want for someone you love. But sometimes the people who love us most are working from a map of us that was drawn a long time ago, and they do not always account for the ways we have changed, or the ways the landscape has shifted around us. Clara, for her part, did not make any decisions quickly. She went about her days, helping in her father's store, visiting neighbors, attending Sunday services, and she observed Edmund Voss as he settled, temporarily he said, into Harwick life. He found work with a local land surveyor within his first 10 days, which was not surprising given his experience. He did not seek Clara out or create situations where their paths would cross. When they did encounter each other, at the store, on the street, once at a church social that they both attended and both seemed faintly uncomfortable at, he was courteous and steady and asked nothing of her. That restraint, more than anything else, was what she kept coming back to. 3 months after Edmund Voss arrived in Harwick, Clara Ashwood sat down at the writing desk in her bedroom and composed a letter. It was not a simple letter to write. She made 4 attempts before she produced a version she was willing to send, and even then she read it twice more before she sealed it. She sent it to the address he had left with her father, the room at the inn where he had extended his stay week by week without comment. The letter said, "You told me to write to you first, and I am writing. I do not know what I am writing toward exactly, and I want to be honest with you about that. I know that I am not the same person I was before you came to my door in February, and I know that some of that is grief and some of it is something else that I cannot name precisely. I know that Thomas trusted you, and I have been thinking about what it means to trust the judgment of someone who knew you better than I do. I would like to have a conversation. Not about any arrangement. Just a conversation. If you are willing. Edmund's reply came 4 days later, which was faster than the postal route should have allowed, which meant he had sent it by hand. The reply said, I am willing. Name the time and I will be there. They met at her father's store, in the back room where her father kept his accounts, which was her way of making the meeting proper without making it formal. Edmund sat across from her with his hat on the table between them, and they talked for 2 hours. Not about Thomas, not about the proposal, not about anything that required a decision. They talked about the survey work and what it was like to spend months mapping country that had never been formally recorded. They talked about Harwick and what it was like to grow up in a place where everyone knew your name before you did. They talked about what it meant to make a promise you were not sure you could keep, and what it meant to keep one you had not been certain about. Somewhere in the second hour, Clara noticed that she had stopped being aware of how the conversation was going and had simply been in it. That was not something she could say about many conversations. She mentioned this to Edmund, not thinking, and then felt self-conscious about having mentioned it. Edmund said, I noticed the same thing. About 40 minutes ago. They met 4 more times over the following month. Each meeting was arranged through letters, each letter careful and clear and not reaching for more than it needed to say. By the 5th meeting, Clara understood several things about Edmund Voss that she had not understood before. She understood that he was lonely in a way that had become so habitual he had stopped identifying it as loneliness. She understood that he was a man who took obligations seriously to the point that it had sometimes cost him more than he had available to spend. She understood that he had made Thomas's promise not because it was easy or convenient but because Thomas had asked him in the manner of a man who was genuinely afraid, and Edmund was constitutionally unable to let genuine fear go unanswered. She understood, also, that she liked him. Not in the way she had liked Thomas, which had been the uncomplicated warmth of a long familiarity. She liked Edmund in a more deliberate way, the way you like something you have had to pay attention to in order to see. She was not sure yet what to do with that, but she was sure that it was real. 6 months after Edmund Voss arrived in Harwick, in August of 1887, when the heat had settled over the town like a second sky, Clara Ashwood asked him to walk with her along the river path that ran behind her family's property. It was the walk she had taken with Thomas many times, in the years when everything between them had been comfortable and settled and unmysterious. She chose it deliberately, because she did not think the past should be hidden from, only understood. They walked for a while without talking. The river was low in August, the stones along its bed visible in ways they were not in spring, and the light on the water had the late afternoon quality that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Clara had been thinking for weeks about what she wanted to say, and she had come to the conclusion that preparation was the wrong approach, that what she needed to do was simply begin and let the words find their own shape. She said, I have been thinking about what Thomas wrote in his letter. About the fixed point. He said I was always the fixed point for him, which was a beautiful thing to say. But I have been thinking about what it means to be a fixed point for someone, and I am not sure I want that to be the only thing I am. I have been a fixed point my whole life. I stayed in Harwick, I waited for letters, I was the thing that did not move while everything else moved around me. I think I am ready to be something else. Edmund listened to all of this without interrupting, which she had come to expect from him and had come to value more than she could easily articulate. When she finished, he said, What are you telling me? She said, I am telling you that I think Thomas was right about you, which is saying something, because Thomas was not always right about people. He was right about very few people, actually, with the exception of me, and I am beginning to think that the exception of you makes two. Edmund looked at her. He said, You are the most careful person I have ever met, Clara Ashwood. She said, Is that a complaint? He said, It is the opposite of a complaint. She said, Then ask me again. Not the way Thomas asked you to ask. The way you would ask, if it were entirely your own. Edmund was quiet for long enough that a heron lifted off from the far bank of the river and made its slow, deliberate way downstream, and they both watched it go without speaking. Then he turned to her and said, I have been in Harwick for 6 months and I know my neighbors' names. I know the baker opens at 5 and the blacksmith closes at noon on Fridays and your father takes his coffee without sugar. I have not been in any place long enough to know those things since I was a boy. I would like to stay in a place long enough to know everything. If you were the reason for staying." Clara looked at the river for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." It was not a complicated answer. It did not need to be. The engagement of Clara Ashwood to Edmund Voss was announced in October of 1887, which gave Harwick the winter to form its final opinion on the matter. The opinions were varied, as opinions in small towns always are, and ranged from the genuinely warm to the persistently skeptical, with a wide middle ground occupied by people who were not sure what to think but were willing to observe. Clara's mother came around, slowly and not without reservation. What changed her was watching Edmund in her daughter's company, the particular quality of attention he paid to Clara, the way he listened when she spoke, the fact that he never tried to smooth her over or redirect her or make her into something more comfortable. Clara's mother had spent decades watching men manage women, which was what most of them called paying attention, and she knew the difference between management and genuine regard. Edmund regarded Clara. That mattered. Her father had decided months earlier. He said very little about it, which was how he registered approval. He simply began including Edmund in conversations about the store, about town business, about the small decisions of family life, and Edmund took his place in those conversations without overstepping and without retreating, which was the only balance that worked in the Ashwood household. The town, by spring, had largely arrived at a version of the story it could live with, which was that Thomas Alcott had been a good man whose early death was a tragedy, and that Clara Ashwood had honored his memory by taking his judgment seriously, and that Edmund Voss had proven himself by staying. Harwick respected people who stayed. It was perhaps the thing the town valued most, in a world that seemed increasingly designed for moving on. And if you are watching this and wondering, as I imagine some of you are, whether it is possible to honor a love you have lost by allowing yourself to be found by something new, I want you to sit with that question for a moment. Because I think Clara Ashwood asked herself that question many times in the months between February and August of 1887, and I think the answer she arrived at was not simple but it was honest. She did not replace Thomas. She did not forget him. She kept his letters in the cedar box beneath her bed, and she did not pretend that the grief had gone anywhere. What she did was refuse to let the grief be the only thing that defined her going forward. That is not disloyalty. That is survival. And sometimes, if you are fortunate, it is more than survival. Sometimes it is the beginning of something you did not plan for and could not have designed and would not trade. Edmund and Clara were married in April of 1888, in the same church where Clara had been baptized and confirmed and had sat through countless Sunday sermons while her mind was somewhere else entirely. The ceremony was small by Harwick standards. The guest list was exactly the people who mattered, which turned out to be fewer than most people expect and more than enough. Clara wore her mother's altered dress, which had been taken in at the waist and let out at the shoulders, adjusted to fit a woman who was not quite her mother. Edmund wore a coat he had purchased in Harwick from a tailor who had been in business on the same street for 30 years. He told the tailor it was the first coat he had ever owned that was made for a specific place rather than for general traveling, and the tailor, who was not a man given to sentiment, wrote the date of the purchase in his ledger with a small star beside it. After the wedding, Clara and Edmund stayed in Harwick. This was not a compromise or a concession, it was a decision they made together, in one of their letter-writing conversations before they were even engaged, when they were still mapping the territory between them and trying to understand where the landmarks were. Edmund said, "I have spent 10 years learning how to leave places. I think I could spend the next 10 learning how to stay in one." Clara said, "Harwick is a good place to learn that." He said, "I know. I have been learning it for 6 months already." Edmund's surveying work shifted from long-distance expedition work to regional mapping, which turned out to be more in demand than either of them had anticipated. The Western Territories were being opened and settled at a pace that required constant charting and documentation, and a man with Edmund's experience who was based in a stable location and could take shorter contracts was exactly what several government agencies needed. He was home for dinner most evenings. This was not a small thing. Clara understood it was not a small thing and never pretended otherwise. They had 2 children in the first 4 years of their marriage, a daughter they named after Clara's mother, and a son they named Thomas. This was discussed carefully and at length before the decision was made, because Clara wanted Edmund to understand that naming the boy Thomas was not about the past, not entirely, but about acknowledgement. Edmund said he understood. He said that Thomas Alcott had made him ride 3 days to keep a promise, which had turned out to be the most consequential 3 days of his life, and that he could think of worse ways to honor that than a name. The boy grew up to be methodical and observant and slightly too serious for his age, which was, everyone agreed, entirely beside the point. Clara kept the cedar box. It stayed beneath the bed for the first year of the marriage, and then she moved it to the top shelf of the wardrobe, and eventually it ended up on the writing desk in the front room, where it held letters from her mother and her sister and her children and, in the later years, from Edmund when his shorter contracts took him away for a week or 2 at a time. It was a box that had started out holding one kind of correspondence and had expanded to hold a life. Clara thought that was probably what boxes were for. I want to talk for a moment about Edmund Voss, and about what it actually cost him to keep the promise he made to Thomas Alcott. Because I think it is easy, from where we are sitting, to see the outcome, the marriage, the children, the life built in Harwick, and assume that the promise was straightforward to keep. It was not. Edmund rode 3 days to Harwick not knowing what he would find. He had a letter to deliver and an offer to make, and he had no particular reason to think the offer would be received with anything other than polite refusal. A grieving woman does not typically welcome a stranger's proposal, regardless of the circumstances. He had prepared himself, on that 3-day ride, for the very real possibility that Clara Ashwood would take the letter, close the door in his face, and that would be the end of it. He had prepared himself to let that be the end of it. What he had not prepared himself for was her. Not in the way people say that about romantic encounters, with the implication that beauty or charm has overwhelmed good sense. What he had not prepared himself for was the particular quality of her attention, the way she asked him to tell her something true about himself before she had even decided whether she wanted to speak to him again. In 31 years of moving through the world, no one had ever asked Edmund that question. He had answered it, and in answering it, had realized that the answer was lonelier than he had known. The promise cost him his certainty. Before Harwick, Edmund Voss had been certain of his own nature, that he was a man built for movement, for the next horizon, for the work of mapping places he would not stay in. Harwick made him uncertain about all of that, and uncertainty is uncomfortable even when it leads somewhere good. He chose to stay in that discomfort rather than retreat to what he knew, and that choice was not small. What the promise gave him was harder to articulate, which is probably why he rarely tried. He gave Clara the news that broke her heart, and then he gave her the space to decide what came next, and then he stayed long enough for something entirely unplanned to take root. What the promise gave him was a fixed point of his own. He had spent 10 years without one, and he had not known what he was missing until he stopped moving long enough to find it. If you have ever made a promise that cost you something, and most of you have, because that is what promises are, then you understand the particular weight of the moment when you realize the cost was worth it. Not because everything turned out well, not because the outcome justified the effort, but because the act of keeping the promise showed you something about yourself that you would not have seen otherwise. Edmund Voss kept a promise made to a dead man, and in doing so discovered that he was a man who could stay. That was worth more to him than any survey contract or Western horizon. Clara Ashwood was asked, many years later, by her daughter, how she had decided to trust a man she did not know. She thought about it for a while, in the careful way she thought about most things, and then she said, I did not decide to trust him. I decided to pay attention to him, and the trust came from paying attention. That is usually how it works, if you let it. Her daughter asked, but how did you know the paying attention would lead anywhere? Clara said, you never know that. You just decide that whatever you find when you look closely is something you can work with. And then you work with it. She was 61 years old when she said that, sitting in the front room of the house she had shared with Edmund for 30 years, the cedar box on the writing desk beside her. Edmund was in the kitchen making coffee, the way he did every morning, and she could hear him moving around in there, the familiar sounds of a familiar man in a familiar place. She thought of Thomas, as she still did sometimes, not with grief exactly, but with the particular tenderness you feel for someone who was a fixed point before you learn to move. She thought of the letter, and the cedar box, and the man on her porch in February who had taken his hat off before he said anything at all. She thought, some promises are made to be given to someone else. Some gifts are delivered by strangers. Some loves begin exactly where another one ended, not as replacement, not as consolation, but as proof that the heart is larger than any single loss. Edmund came in from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. He set one on the table beside her without being asked, because after 30 years he knew exactly where she wanted it. He sat down across from her, the same chair he had sat in on that February afternoon when she had made him tea and asked him questions and held herself very still while the world rearranged itself around her. She picked up her coffee. She looked at him. He looked back. That was enough. After 30 years, that was always enough. If you are new to this channel, welcome. Hidden Crown Stories is where we tell the tales that history kept quiet and time nearly buried. Subscribe and stay close, because there is always another story waiting just beneath the surface. And if today's story moved you in any way, leave a comment below. I want to know which moment stayed with you. Thank you for watching.